Okay, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. My name is Naya Flores Toussaint. I am a scholar of sociology of religion. I can't say recent anymore, but the pandemic makes it feel like 2019 was yesterday. A graduate of Union Theological Seminary at Columbia University and the New School, where I studied international relations and the sociology of religion. I am so glad to be your host and to see some familiar faces and some new faces. It's a pleasure to meet those who I have not met yet, and I hope to connect with you all. Just some quick announcements. This Tuesday, and actually this conversation very much applies to what our presenters will be speaking about, and I'm just going to share the flyer with you all. Some may be aware that there are about 30 Haitian men that have been deported back to Haiti and are facing a lack of medical attention and a lack of food due to their families living in the US. And they are actually facing indefinite incarceration in Haiti due to the assassination of President Moise. The police commissioner has placed ransom amounts on folks who are supposed to be released once arriving to Haiti. And so their families here in the US cannot afford to pay a chef to give them food every day. For those who aren't aware, in Haitian prisons, your family must provide food every day or you do not eat. Nor can they, or their families here in the US, afford to pay these high ransoms. So if you are able, we are asking anyone and everyone to join us this Tuesday, September 13th, to hear at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific time, to hear from their families about ways that we can help, and also from some immigration lawyers about ways we can push our government, especially in this time of political unrest in Haiti, to possibly pause deportations back to Haiti. And so, yes, there is that. And then there is, of course, our H.S.A. conference coming up October 7th through the 9th in Washington, D.C. We highly encourage you all to come. We have amazing things planned for you if you can be there. And it would just also be great just to reconnect, our first time back together since, the pandemic. And so we are excited to get on that. So yes, once again, thank you all for being here. And before we hear from our speakers, I would like to take some time, because this is a cafe, to honor our ancestors with some cafe. And so if you would join me as I jete cafe or jete glow. And I jete glow today just because of our brilliance that has brought us all here today. I jete H.S.A. because we are experiencing death, but we are also expecting life. I jete glow because our scholarship honors the breath. Our scholarship honors those on the other side. Our scholarship honors those who have yet to come. And I believe that the ancestors will guide us to not just be scholars, but to be activists who are activated to take our scholarship into the world, on the streets, away from white supremacy and ivory towers. Thank you all. Ayibobo. So our first speaker, we're gonna jump right in, and I should say how we'll do this. So we will hear from both of our presenters, and then we will have some commentary in response to their presented works. And after our commentator gives their comments, we will open this up for casual conversation. Some of you already caught that. We were just warming up to one another. So feel free as if we were all together, whether that's in the laku or in a cafe, wherever, laugh, get loud, get, very Black, get very Haitian, whatever it is that you need for us to stir each other on for goodness. We want to hear about your scholarship. We want you to challenge our presenters in order to ensure that their scholarship remains relevant. Okay, so please prepare your questions, get a notepad if you need to write those things down so that we can be prepared to pose our questions to our presenters. But I'm going to jump right in to honor everyone's time. And so our first presenter is PhD candidate or soon to be Dr. Willie Mack. And the title of their presentation is Triple Minority: Haitian Boat People, Policing and Mass Incarceration in New York City. A little bit about Mr. Mack. They are a PhD candidate at SUNY Stony Brook. His research interests focus on race, capitalism, and the carceral state in the 20th century United States. His dissertation takes a transnational approach to the development of the carceral state in Haiti and the US during 1970 through the 1990s. Will has had articles published with Black Perspectives, the Blog for African Americans Intellectual History Society, the Society for US Intellectual Society, and Next Chapter, the digital form for the University of Chicago's Race and Capitalism Project. So I pass it over to you, Mr. Mack, for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm very excited and honored to be here today. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my research. I'm looking forward to hearing some feedback. Let me just get my PowerPoint up here. I can share it. Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see my PowerPoint. Okay, so yes, my dissertation is entitled Triple Minority: Haitian Immigrants, Policing and Mass Incarceration. It was the 70s, I pushed it back to the 60s, and I'll explain why in a minute, since 1960s and 1990s. As I said, I'm at Stony Brook University. My training is in history, US history post-Civil War, and I became interested in Haitian-US relations back when I was getting my master's degree, and I realized that studying the age of revolutions in the 17 and 1800s, that the Haitian Revolution was excluded, and that there was this fear of Haiti as a Black republic in the Western Hemisphere by Southern plantation elites and even Northern political elites as well. And that spurred my interest in learning more about Haiti and US relations, and then my own interest in the carceral field is the formation of this dissertation and what I plan to do. So on March 16, 2000, undercover police officer Anthony Vasquez shot and killed Patrick Dorsman, a 20-year-old father of two from Port-au-Prince, Haiti. The incident occurred after Vasquez approached and solicited Dorsman for marijuana. Dorsman became agitated as Vasquez repeatedly asked him if he was selling drugs, to which Dorsman loudly declared that he did not sell drugs. A scuffle ensued, and Vasquez shot Dorsman, killing him almost instantly. As New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani used the shooting to bolster his image as a tough-on-crime politician. First, Giuliani refused to meet with Dorsman's family after the shooting, and then Giuliani took the unprecedented step of unsealing Dorsman's juvenile arrest record and used it to justify the shooting of Vasquez, claiming that Dorsman was, quote, no altar boy. 5 months after the shooting, a grand jury determined that it was an accident and refused to indict Officer Vasquez. However, in 2003, the city settled with Dorsman's family in civil court for $2.5 million. How did this Haitian immigrant, who had a family and was working hard to support that family, become the target of police violence and tough-on-crime rhetoric? To answer this overarching question, my dissertation analyzes Haitian immigrant communities through the intersection of the carceral state, policing, surveillance and incarceration, and restrictive immigrant policy. These are just some images in the aftermath of Dorsman's killing. And even down here on the bottom left, that's Abner Louima. If you're familiar with that case, he was tortured, a Haitian immigrant tortured by the NYPD. And you can see here on the top right, Giuliani with his pro-NYPD cop, with next to someone else who we don't want to get into today. But then you can see the reactions by the community after Dorsman clashing with police. Counterintuitively, however, my dissertation illuminates mass incarceration in America by taking a transnational approach. It focuses on policing of Haitians in both the US and in Haiti. I first look at policing in Haiti during the 1970s as Haitian dictator Jean-Claude Duvalier liberalized the Haitian economy by opening it up to foreign investment. Haiti's liberalization process during the 1970s occurred when Duvalier promised to transform or liberalize the Haitian economy from one focused primarily on rural agricultural production to light industry. He also promised to lessen the restrictions on freedom of the press and to reorganize the feared militia, the Tutamakuts. However, Jean-Claude's liberalization process, rather than reducing the power of the state to inflict violence on the people of Haiti, enlarged the mechanisms of oppression and incarceration in Haiti, supported by the United States, which simultaneously excluded Haitians seeking to escape the Duvalier regime. Indeed, the opening or liberalization of Haiti's economy was part of what I call a transnational carceral network that was mutually beneficial for both the US capitalist interests and foreign investment in Haiti and Haitian elites at the expense of the poor and working class Haitians. I should note here that I define carceral as the various tools, mechanisms, and institutions that the state uses to coerce, manipulate, and discipline individuals to conform to and normalize social relations in a modern bourgeois capitalist system. That is, the carceral state exists to protect free market growth and its processes while normalizing extreme wealth inequality and rationalizing poverty as a character flaw. And this is a picture of Duvalier here. You can see Ronald Reagan during the 1980s, the Coast Guard interdiction of Haitian migrants to the United States. Duvalier saying to Ronald Reagan, Ronnie, send them back to me, I'll take good care of them, holding the gun, obviously signifying state violence. While Ronnie Reagan says, don't worry, Jean-Claude, they didn't have to cut documents to prove they are refugees. The US again turned to the US again turned to policing to pacify the Haitian people in 1994 when it helped Jean Aristide returned to the presidency after he was removed during a coup in 1990. Aristide's left-leaning liberation theology was counterintuitive to the US's free market foreign policy interests, and the US became directly involved in pacifying and occupying Haiti. Under President Bill Clinton, who had made promoting democracy and free markets around the world a cornerstone of his foreign policy, the US directly inserted policing forces into Haiti by establishing a professional police force trained by Western policing agencies. The role of the police was critical to Clinton's administration's plan to consolidating the spread of democracy, end quote, throughout the Caribbean, as well as stabilizing the political situation in Haiti to encourage foreign and domestic investment into the country. Through the US State Department's, the Department of Justice's International Criminal Investigative Training and Assistance Program, or ECTAP, the US worked directly with the Haitian government to train and provide aid and guidance on developing a modern and professional police force in Haiti. This police force, which included second-generation Haitian Americans, viewed the Haitian people with the same contempt and racism that domestic policing referred to Black Americans at home. This slide shows US military police in Haiti in 1994. And for comparison, there's a picture of Clinton with the Chicago Police Department discussing his 1994 crime bill, which is responsible for the dramatic increase in incarceration of Black people in the 90s through today. There's also a picture here. This is ICTAP's logo, and then some some graduates of a police academy that the US was able to establish back in the 1990s. In both cases, I argue that the US explored a unique brand of policing designed to discipline the people of Haiti to make the country more suitable to foreign investment. In the 1970s, the US did this by providing money, training, and arms to Duvalier, and in 1994 by creating a professional police force modeled after urban policing regimes in the US. In this way, my dissertation takes a transnational perspective by examining the US empire through the lenses of policing, incarceration, capitalism, and race. And in here, this is a picture of Michelle Duvalier, Jean-Claude Duvalier's wife, in 1986 on a trip to Paris, while her country was, the people of Haiti were struggling economically and materially. She was buying fur coats and fancy portraits. And then this other is a picture of Clinton talking about the New York Times, boasting how Clinton's going to discipline and rein in Haiti and Haitian people through the use of policing. Comparatively, my dissertation also looks at the experiences of Haitians in the United States, specifically in New York City from 1960s to the 1990s. Beginning in 1960, many of these immigrants were Haitian elites and professionals looking to escape from the totalitarian Duvalier regime. However, as Duvalier's liberalization process accelerated, they were joined by Haiti's poor and working class who sought to escape the violence and economic exploitation that defined Duvalier's regime. It's also during this period, starting in 1965, after the passage of the Immigration and Naturalization Act that reformed US immigration policy and allowed people from the global South to start immigrating to the United States en masse, that New York City began to see a demographic shift as white working class ethnic groups, fearing the increasing number of Black residents encroaching on their neighborhoods, began fleeing the city to the suburbs, and Black and Afro-Caribbean people took their place. In this way, I argue Haitian immigrants to New York City during the 1970s were central to the shifting notions of the city's identity, the rise of vigilante policing in neighborhoods that were seeing these demographic shifts, and even in some that were not. Oh, I lost my, hold on, got my things back. White flight from the city, changes to the city's labor market, and economic disinvestment from city welfare programs in the 1970s. And you can see here, here's a population map of central Brooklyn, the Flatbush area. In 1960, the white population, you can see very much a white neighborhood. In 1980, you can see that's very much has changed. And then here's the Black population in 1960, and then after 1965, as immigration from the Caribbean and other areas, from the other Black neighborhoods of New York, such as Harlem, increase, you can see the density increase in terms of population density. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, as Haitians settled in New York City, they identified themselves as a triple minority of Black, foreign language speakers, and immigrants. They're a unique ethnic group distinct from English-speaking Afro-Caribbean groups and Black Americans, and at times they're in contention with these groups. However, as I show in my dissertation, Haitian and Black Americans would occasionally ally together when confronting issues of systemic racism by white Americans, other immigrant groups, the police, or if it was politically beneficial. From there, my dissertation examines Haitians immigrants' experience with law and order and get tough policing in the 1980s and 1990s, centered around tensions between Haitians, Black and white Americans, and other immigrant groups, specifically Korean immigrants. These tensions manifest themselves during a boycott of a Korean-owned grocery store, the Red Apple Grocery, in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn in 1990 by Haitians after a Korean merchant got into a physical altercation with a Haitian customer. The Haitian protesters were quickly joined by Black Americans and radical activists who claimed the presence of Korean businesses in Black neighborhoods was a form of economic injustice and demonstrated the long systemic history of racism and oppression against Black Americans. These Black activists united with Haitians under the banner of Pan-Africanism and Black economic self-determination against anti-Black racism. White New Yorkers and mainstream media quickly joined in on the side of the Koreans, describing them as the quote unquote good immigrants compared to the lazy, undeserving Blacks who complained about problems of their own making. The police and New York politicians viewed the boycott through a racialized lens as well that criminalized any Black person, Haitian or not, involved or perceived to be involved in the boycott. Through all of this, the status of Haitians as a unique ethnic immigrant group with their own concerns, needs, and even language was erased, and they were simply labeled as Black. Thus, the boycott became a flashpoint on questions of race, identity, and belonging in 1990s New York City. And Haitians, rather than being seen as a unique immigrant group, were swept up and grouped into racist myths and stereotypes of Blackness in the United States. And here's a couple of images from the boycott. Here's the red apple here on Church Avenue, some protesters, Black Power route poster that was placed out, and a clipping from the New York Post, just one of many examples of the way they were claiming that the protesters were anti-Asian racism, anti-white racism during this protest. Ultimately, I argue that the triple minority status of Haitian immigrants and the US's foreign policy relations, foreign relation policies toward Haiti are predicated on anti-Black racism and empire, both of which are manifested through policing, both domestically and abroad. Some of the sources that I draw from are from the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture's Haiti collection, which includes the Ira Golubin collection and the Haiti Desjugage collection. These collections focus on firsthand experiences of Haitian refugees and political prisoners who had escaped from Haiti during the Duvalier regime of the 70s and 1980s. I also look at a David M. Rubenstein rare book and manuscript collection at Duke University. This library contains the American for Immigration Justice Records, the Caribbean Sea Migration Collection, the Radio Haiti Archive, and the Washington Office on Latin American Records. I also look at the University of Miami's collection of Haitian diaspora oral histories, and Florida International University's Alex and Carol Stepnick collection on Haitian migration. So thank you.
Thank you, soon to be Dr. Mack. Thank you, wonderful, fertile, and just, yeah, a lot of questions. I'm sure there's a lot of thoughts that will be coming. So please don't, I know it can be weird when we just jump to another presentation and you don't get any feedback right away, but it's coming. And so, yes, please, if you have questions, write them down. Don't forget them. We will have time after our commentator for Dr. Mack to answer your questions. Get ready. You got to get used to it, Dr. Mack. Okay, so our next presenter will be presenting on Haitian internationalism in the age of global Blackness. Dr. Felix Jean-Louis is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of California at Irvine. He specializes in Haitian history at the micro level, Caribbean, US African American, Afropean, and the African diaspora in general at the broadest level. He is currently revising his dissertation for a book entitled Exporting the Revolution, Haitian Internationalism in the Age of Global Blackness, 1890 to 1944, the subject of which is the topic of his talk today. Thank you, Dr. Jean-Louis.
Thank you, Dr. Toussaint. So just to follow up, Mr. Mack, future Dr. Max, I lived a lot of this growing up in New York in the 90s. I was working for New York One News when Abdullah happened. And the way you represent that really touched me. And a lot of this overlap, the Pan-Africanism that you talked about, some of it is being founded at the moment I'm talking about. And the approach of economic activism against Black subjugation, I think I captured that correctly, is in fact a lot of the efforts to overturn white supremacy, especially that of the UNIA. And I'll talk about that in a second. So let me share my screen here. And let me do this like that. Why can't, there it is. So the title of my presentation is L'Union fait la force, Haitians and the African Diaspora in the Age of Global Blackness. Now I forgot I gave the title of the book, which kind of gives away my ending, but I hope to keep your attention anyway. And what I call the Age of Blackness is a moment beginning at the end of the 19th century, where people of African descent increasingly began to reunite and to meet each other for the first time and discuss the conditions of Blackness in general. And this is particular because of the state of the Afro-descended world at the time. By the end of the 19th century, slavery had been ended. Sorry, I'm just setting a timer so I can monitor myself. I'm not texting. Slavery had ended finally in Brazil in 1888, but at the same time, the proper European colonization of Africa was going underway. The French, the English, the German, the Belgian were starting to really draw and carve out the African map. And what that did was to start a greater influx of people of African descent into the metropole. And in this time, Haiti emerges, or had emerged, if you think about people like Brendan Bird's work, as sort of this important place in the history of people of African descent, as the only place where people of African descent had overthrown their slave master, as the only place where people of African descent had overthrown colonialism at that time. And this allowed them a certain level of independent movement throughout the Atlantic. Historically, Haitians had gone to Paris because of their colonial legacy, and some of who were related to French people. But this nationhood allowed Haitians, at least elite Haitians, to travel across the Atlantic. And this leads me to argue that although they were never in great numbers anywhere, elite Haitian men largely were often at the vanguard of movements to liberate people of African descent globally. And in my dissertation, in my book project, I focus on men because they are the ones there in the historical record, but this also leads to a critique of masculinity as an impediment to diasporic cohesion. Famously, Dubois and Marcus Garvey were in this fight, for who could be the biggest man in charge, to paraphrase an expression. In Paris, there was this similar impediment to it because of masculine practices. Everybody wants to be a chief. If you translate that into Creole, you would understand. But despite the impediments, Haitians were at the forefront of the movement to liberate Black people from subjugation. And we know of these intellectual arguments. You have Antonin Fermat at the top left-hand corner. You have Louis-Joseph Janvier in the middle there. Suzanne Comelle-Sylvain on the left, and Jean Price Mars at the bottom right. And these intellectual arguments are there, and they are circulating throughout the Black world. But I want to focus on activists. And the first activist who really starts this movement, I think I call him the primogenitor of the Pan-African, or at least one of the primogenitors of the Pan-African movement that Mr. Mack kind of pointed to at the end of the 20th century. His whole name is Marie-Joseph Benoit d'Artagnan Sylvain, excuse the accent. And like I said, he's the primogenitor of the early Pan-African movement, an African and intellectual who traveled throughout the Black world. He travels several times to Ethiopia, Abyssinia, and makes relationship with the court of Menelik, and he becomes an aide-de-camp of the court of Menelik. And we'll get back to this. His movements connected the diasporas. He, in Paris, founds the first, one of the first Black newspapers known as La Fraternité. And if you look at the subheading, it's Organe des intérêts d'Haïti et la race noire, the organ of the interest of Haiti and the Black race. This is an important sort of unifying element of the establishing of the African diaspora, tying our news together. And in the pages, they talk about Haiti, they talk about the Caribbean, they talk about African Americans in the United States, they talk about the colonized world, Dahomey, one of the French colonies in Africa. And this starts to bring a sense of unity, of reciprocity, of connection across disparate places. And what it culminates in is that he is a representative at the Pan-African Congress of 1900 in London. He's one of the organizers. He had been a member of the African Association that put this conference on. Henry Sylvester Williams, a Trinidadian, was the main organizer of this. And at this conference, he makes a lot of statements that sort of foreshadow that which comes later in the more mature movements. And something he argues that one of the main colonizers are the apostles of true civilization. And this presages arguments made by Ami Césaire in discourses on the colonialism. And he includes the church. And again, Césaire makes this point 40 plus years later. But at this Pan-African Congress, he emerges as they're representing Haiti and Ethiopia, Abyssinia. And just to show you how diasporic, like a blackity-black movement this is that here he is a representative of the only independent Black republic in the world, and simultaneously a representative of the only uncolonized country in Africa. This is sort of a powerful moment and a powerful representation. Just to think about, in 1937, C.L.R. James writes The Black Jacobins, the history of the Haitian Revolution, in part to inspire the rest of the diasporic world. And at the same time that the diasporic world is uniting against Ethiopian aggression to Italy. So this is sort of presaging the thinking of it. And if you see here in the right-hand side, you have W.B. Du Bois. He was connected to Booker T. Washington. Now, there's a missing part of my research, and I know I shouldn't talk about it, but just to intrigue you, that between the beginning of the 20th century and the First World War, there are Haitians who are solidifying these movements, the diasporic connections. At Tuskegee University, which was a major site of diasporic reunion, where people of African descent from the continent, from the Caribbean, from Central America, from the United States were meeting and discussing Blackness, comparing Blackness, and living Blackness. And some of these Haitians that I've already located on Jean-Joseph Adam, who we'll talk about later, Alexandre Lavaux, and somebody, J.L. Sanon, which I haven't located fully yet, but Sanon, later on, Paul Sanon was a activist against the US occupation. And there's a Sanon who has been recently in the news attached to the assassination of Louise. But in Paris, Georges Sylvain is there, and he is founding a movement for the upliftment of Black people there. He has a publication called the Étoile d'Afrique, in which Haitians are writing poetry and articles, and including former president, future president Vincent and Louis Bonneau. And Vincent and Bonneau were in active fighting against each other during the occupation. But in these pages, they are writing together. And just to show you some of the pluralities of opinions and approaches that are starting to emerge. And in other research, I have found that Haitians did serve the French army in World War I, and service in the World War I army was a very important site of Blackness making. This will come out. And here we have a photo of the graduating class of Tuskegee in 1908. This guy here in the bottom right hand is Alexandre Lavaux. And you see there are Black people here, and there are even Asians. And so this is sort of just a place where a disparate group of people are meeting. And World War I, like I suggested, was a cleave, and we have the modernist movement that emerges because of here, but it catapults this Black movement. And in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, were the mature iteration of the events that started in the late 19th century, the New Negro or Harlem Renaissance, the Pan-African movements in London, they were all connected, and Haitians were central actors across all of these shores. The UNIA, the Universal Improvement Association, founded by Marcus Garvey, dedicated to the social and economic uplift of the Black race, Africa for the Africans famously, various Negro enterprises like the Black Star Line, and Haitians were central to the explosion of the UNIA membership. They brought Liberia into the plan and tried to save Marcus Garvey as the saboteurs doomed him. And here are some of the Haitians. You have Elisa Cadet in the upper left-hand corner here. He's the one who brings Liberia into the UNIA fold in the chance encounter with the Liberian president. Eli Garcia here was one of the most powerful people in the UNIA, perhaps the second most powerful at one point. And when the UNIA starts to fall apart and Garvey starts to look to Paris, he turns to Theodora Holly as the editor of the French section of the Negro World, the newspaper of the UNIA, and Jean-Joseph Adam, the guy on the far left here, who had gone to Tuskegee, is the translator and part of the delegation to the 1922 League of Nations, and becomes the UNIA representative in France for the next few years. And at the bottom here is Luc d'Orsainville, who tried to bring the UNIA in Haiti, and for a number of reasons, it didn't emerge. There was another branch, and I call this Aller plus capable, which is sort of the motto of the Liberal Party. And this is represented by the Union Patriotique, which was an elite anti-occupation group founded by Georges Sylvain. Beginning in 1919, they start a transnational relationship with the NAACP. Haitians were very visible in the 1919 Pan-African Conference, 1921 and 1927. And the Haitians were able to merge the currents of the Pan-African Congress that made the argue that elite people of African descent should be the ones to lead the quote race out of the subjugation. No more important was Dante Belgaard. He was the preeminent figure of the New Negro Renaissance in ways that W.B. Du Bois can never be. He was the Haitian representative to the League of Nations, where he made powerful defenses of Haiti, where he made powerful defenses of people of African descent globally. And in 1921, it was the first time he left Haiti. He presents at this Pan-African Congress and becomes the star of the movement. W.B. Du Bois, Walter White, they're in love with him, metaphorically speaking, but they are enamored by his power and his intellect. Now, in Paris, there's a lot going on at the same time. Historic colonial times brought Haitians to France, and in the post-World War I period, increasing members of the diaspora arrived to work, which sparks a Pan-African movement. The Ligue Universelle de Défense de la Race Noire is one of these early movements, the Comité de Défense de la Race Noire, the Ligue de Défense de la Race Noire, and the Union of Travailleurs Noirs, all emerged as these groups that sort of work to unite the disparate people of African descent and make sort of a Pan-African francophonie. And all of this anticipates what becomes negritude and lays the foundation for the negritude movement. So one of these people is Jean Barreau, and we have here his police surveillance file that we see. Now, I'm doubly related to Jean Barreau. My grandmother is Barreau with 2 R's. And in the family, there was a fight, and one of the brothers got mad in the truest Haitian sense, cut 1 R. And this Jean Barreau is part of that line, who is connected to a cousin of mine elsewhere. Dr. Léo Sajus, he's one of the most important of these Haitians in the Pan-African movement. He slides back and forth between the Marxist side and the moderate side, and he ends up a minister of Liberia to Poland. He ends up moving to Liberia. He also founds this very important journal, La Revue du Monde Noir, the Review of the Black World, and we see it here. It was a bilingual publication designed to bring the Black world, the 2 of the largest languages of the Black world, together. Camille Sejak is one of my favorite people in this. He was a very irascible person, and he was members of the Negro Committee at the 1927 League Against Imperialism conference, one of the major anti-colonial events. I don't know which one of these people he is. I think he's the guy on the right just because his face is upset. And he was a guy who often was in conflict with people and very short-tempered. So the surprise is that the title of the book is Exporting the Revolution, and that Union fait la force. It makes us wonder for 2 reasons. First, any conversation with a Haitian historian, lay or otherwise, from my experience, has always come back to this. No matter what we're talking to, they say to you, what you have to understand is that during the revolution, and it points to the unfinished Haitian Revolution, but it makes me think about what the revolution was. The revolution was more than than enslaved people overthrowing their masters. This was a diasporic event, a group of disparate people of African descent overcoming the divisions of language, culture, religion, and etc., and uniting in opposition to Black subjugation. This is the moment when Toussaint convinces Dieudonné, the Maouan leader, to enter the struggle. This is what Pétion and Dessalines realized in 1802, where they unite forces to conclude the revolution. And this is sort of what the Haitians who were the inheritors of this movement realized, and that unity amongst people of African descent across the divides was fundamental to achieve the ultimate aim of liberating the race in its entirety. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jean-Louis. Awesome presentation. And I am going to jump right into our commentator, Dr. Kiran Jayaram, and I will introduce him now. Dr. Kiran C. Jayaram is an assistant professor in anthropology at the University of South Florida. He co-edited 2 volumes Keywords of Mobility in 2016, and Transnational Hispaniola in 2018. And a third volume, Island Anthropologies, will be published separately in English, Haitian Creole, and Spanish. He co-founded the Transnational Hispaniola Collective and served in executive positions within the Haiti Dominican Republic section of LASA and the Society for Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology. He recently finished a term as acting editor-in-chief for the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology. His current research focuses on the dynamics of anthropological training in higher education, specifically at universities in India, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, his wife and he became parents to Maratsa, twin boys to be exact, in 2021. So yep, Dr. Jayaram, I invite you for your comments in response to Dr. Jean-Louis and Dr. Mack.
Thank you very much for those kind words. And thank you, Mr. Dr. Mack and Dr. Jean-Louis, for your presentations. I feel it's a bit of a daunting task giving the grand and meaningful works that both of you all have done, covering so much work, a book in a 10, 15-minute talk. So rather than trying to address all of that, I'll just kind of raise a couple of questions and let you respond, and then maybe true to a coffee sort of style, we can just open it up from there, if that's okay. So yeah, let's go with Mack's presentation here about the triple minority, which I particularly enjoy. You might be able to hear actually one of my boys in the background, so just.
No worries, this is the Laku, perfect.
All right. So, no, so I really enjoy that. I mean, I've done some work on police actions and whatnot, and I appreciate that. I particularly enjoyed the mention of the reference of the 1965 Immigration Act and the relationship of that to migration. And it got me thinking about some of the distinctions in the ways in which people from Haiti have migrated and the way they've been called, like the so-called boat people versus the so-called Boeing people that may have moved to different places, and perhaps before 1965 that had some sort of link to development of diaspora communities in France and Canada. I just don't know. Perhaps you could, if you know something about it or not. One question I had was about you talked about this connection and the mobilization of Black communities, particularly with the Red Apple Market scenario and others. I'm wondering, during that period of time, were there moments where there was, I'm sure there were there moments where there was a little bit of ambivalence, particularly after the onset of news and misinformation regarding HIV and Haitian populations that Alex Stepik has written about in Miami? How much of that figured into some of the collaborative activism that you saw? So that was one specific question. Let me look at my other notes really quickly. And this is to some degree looking at your abstract here that I looked at, is that I appreciated this issue of looking at the state, but I wondered if you might consider, as a part of this transnational framework, the way in which, if you could maybe speak to the ways in which different levels of the state interact, because you mentioned Giuliani, and Giuliani was just the mayor of New York City, right? And so how does that connect with, the training of police officers in Haiti? right? And there's a state apparatus, and so perhaps it's in the conceptual framework, which of course you can't talk about everything, but it was just a point that I wanted to raise. And I'll stop there with your talk. Then turning to Dr. Jean-Louis' talk, which I found fascinating. I have started to, for my own work, start to look into the Sylvain family as well, as part of the histories and sort of precursors to a lot of social science. Not just Georges Sylvain, not just Suzanne Camille Sylvain, but all of her siblings as well, who were very much involved in the establishment of the L'École Normale and a lot of precursors to anthropology and sociology of education in Haiti. So I very much appreciated raising them. And I wanted to ask a couple of things here. And I particularly also appreciated the mention of the masculinities involved, because oftentimes when you talk about Janvier and Firmin at the Paris Anthropological Society as diplomats and whatnot, but they were men, right, as government representatives, and the presence of women is silenced, to use a particular word. But I wondered, when you mentioned Dante Belgaard, I'm reminded of a work that he had published with Mercer Cook. And it was the Haitian American Anthology, which is a very peculiar book, where it was teaching about Haiti in English. And I think it was, you can imagine how this would be used. But it's published in 1944. In the introduction to that book, they talk about not a Pan-Africanism or a Blackness per se, but they're talking about Pan-Americanism. So I'm wondering, is that to some degree a foil for what you're talking about, or how does that match with your work? So, and I think, is this maybe there's a class race issue where Belgaard is perhaps distinct phenotypically from other actors, and so it kind of represents this long division between Pétion and Dessalines, which is kind of another sort of parallel between what was the revolution and what are we carrying forward was the legacy of this revolution. So, so I'll stop there. Just so I do have to apologize right now. I wish I could stay longer. I have another appointment and a meeting actually at 3. I'll stick around for a few minutes, but thank you very much for the opportunity to respond and listen to your talk. So.
Dr. Mack, Dr. Jean-Louis. Let's start with Dr. Mack.
Okay, thank you for the comments. I appreciate it. To answer the first question about the ambivalence of HIV collaborative activism between Haitians and Black Americans, the simple answer that I've come across so far in my research is looking at some oral histories that I came across in some interviews from Haitians activists who were involved in the Red Apple grocery boycott, and how they talked about, when this boycott originated, at first it was about the mistreatment of Haitian customers by Koreans. Apparently it's something that was going on for a while, and it very quickly turned into something also that talked about this, the FDA ban on Haitian blood and HIV and all these stereotypes of Haitians being, diseased and dirty people, which is, obviously horrible stereotypes. But as Black activists, Black American activists got involved and started bringing more of a Pan-African, self-determinist, Black power rhetoric to the boycott, the activists that I've been reading about talked about how that kind of transformed they didn't pull away from their concerns and what they were trying to bring to the attention of New Yorkers and the larger public at large, but it also made them more politically aware of the struggles of systemic history, the history of Black American struggles, such as Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, but more specifically Malcolm X and more the Black Panther Party and more these radical elements or the leftist leaning out elements of the civil rights movement or the Black Power movement. And it brought more of a political awareness to their activism and what they were doing and got them to see a broader way of understanding their struggles in relationship with Black American struggles, if that makes sense. And that was what I've seen from oral archives, oral histories on the events from activists who were involved and how they interpreted it. In terms of different levels of the state in connection with police officers, that's an incredibly complicated answer that could take up the entire rest of the time that we have, which I won't do because that's not fair and I'm not prepared to do it either. But that is kind of actually the genesis of my project of what I'm looking at is there's multi-layers of the state from very high up, looking at, the federal government, the role of the Democratic Party, led by Clinton, and even going further back, Joe Biden, who we know now, talking about policing in 1980, moving to the right of someone that we very much think of in the United States as a law and order person, Ronald Reagan. Joe Biden was one step to his right, preaching about how policing is paramount to the safety in the international community, in the Caribbean specifically, to the United States and stopping drugs and crime within the community. That trickled down into the politics of the 1980s Democratic Party, where you see the rise of, it wasn't till later, but you see eventually the rise of the Clintons and the New Democrats who brought this moralism into Black communities and spoke to Black communities, kind of very, very paternalistically in terms of the sense that it's up to Black people to police themselves. But at the same time, they started ramping up policing through community involvement. And that led to the rise of community policing in New York City on a more local level. And before Dinkins in 1990, David Dinkins became mayor of New York in the 1990s and dealt with the Red Apple boycott and policing and so forth. Ed Koch, who was the mayor in the 80s, was using a very heavy-handed approach to policing, especially Black communities. He was very antagonistic towards Black communities, not just Black Americans, but also Black immigrant communities, Haitian, Afro-Caribbean, English-speaking Afro-Caribbean communities. And then in the 1990s, when Dinkins became mayor, and Lee Brown became his police commissioner, they introduced this, what they considered a softer form of policing to alleviate the racial tensions that the Koch administration had created through community policing. And community policing was meant to bring the community into decisions on policing, but in turn, what it really did was alienate the poorer sections of these communities and communities where there were a lot of people who are, unauthorized immigrants. Maybe they were homeless and so forth, which spoke very directly to immigrant communities. And it didn't work. There was never the community police. Some of the community policing never actually built a community. It just worked to criminalize the community in the long run. So it's a very short, kind of broad answer to your question, but that's kind of how the state, from the national to the state to the kind of local level of policing, at least how I envision it. In terms of looking at a transnational perspective, again, looking at how Clinton approached Haiti in terms of using policing to discipline the public, to discipline the ground, to build a community. ICTAP, the organization in charge from the American perspective, US perspective, of building the police force, literally use in their document, introducing their training program to the Haitian elites, described Haiti as a lawless kind of backwards country, and that by creating a professional policing unit or force in Haiti, you'll create a more modern, advanced community that will be more responsive to not just, eliminating crime and violence, but also creating better schools, creating better hospitals, creating better infrastructure, and all these things kind of worked in the benefit of, U.S. and financial elites, but at the same time, as we know, policing just continued to regurgitate the cycles of exploitation and violence on poorer people and people who were not of, property owners and so forth. So I hope that answers your question. Again, it's a very complicated. I'm trying to keep it succinct.
Thank you. And Dr. Jayaram, if you just have a few minutes to hear from Dr. Jean-Louis.
Yeah,
2
Dr.
minutes.
Jayaram, yeah, sorry. And I want to apologize. I really wanted to get all of my information out in one talk. So I'm sorry if anybody was overwhelmed. But just to say about Sylvain and his ethnographic work, he was a member of the Société d'Ethnographie in Paris, in France, at the turn of the 20th century. And some of his trips to Abyssinia are discussed in these pages. And the more research I've done, I find that he's a contributing author on sociological levels when it pertains to people of African descent. He published his dissertation that translates in English the fate of the indigenous population of the colonies in 1900. And like I said, I think in my talk, that it presages a lot of the arguments made by Aimé Césaire in Discours sur la colonisation. And he really emphasizes the economic exploitation and the violence behind colonization. Dante Belgaard is a very complicated individual. As you said, he was known as sort of an elitist, but what was known about him was, although he was a Francophile, he never forgot his Blackness. This is a direct quote about him. There's a Millery Paulnier, distinguished scholar at NYU, writes about Black Pan-Africanism. And I think this is a little bit of what you allude to, Black Pan-Americanism, sorry. And what you allude to. And for me, in my argument, I do agree that Black Pan-Americanism is an avenue of contact and collaboration between people of African descent in the Americas. But my argument is just that it's just one thoroughfare in the interconnected avenues of Pan-Africanism. So I'm sure that there's Pan-Africanism that connects the countries of Africa and people in Africa together. There's a Pan-Africanism that unites Francophile people together. And all of these are avenues, and people within each group are talking around. So if you drew a map of each of these things, you would see it's an interconnected web. People focus on things specifically, like Belgaard at the Organization of American States, and he talks about American specific things there. But when he's in Paris, he talks about the diaspora at large. He argues in defense of the South Africans bombed by the Germans. He argues in defense of Haitians. He argues in defense of colonized people of African descent everywhere. So this is just one avenue. And if you focus on that avenue, it looks sort of very hermetic, but taking a larger diasporic approach, you see how it's connected. Willie Mack, have you seen Rachel Magloire's documentary Déporté?
No, I have not.
Okay, it's an important thing to find out what happens to some of these Haitians that were incarcerated. It's a really great documentary. And I just want to say, I was at the Brooklyn Bridge March in defense of Haitians' accusations of race in, 1988 or 1989. And as a young Haitian in a Black space, in a New York Black space where we were made to feel ashamed of our Haitianness, this was one of the moments where we are starting to emerge proud, that, we famously like to point to the Fugees and Five Dog, I Like 'em Brown, Yellow, Puerto Rican, and Haitian as sort of moments where we announce ourselves. But here is a moment, like you're saying, in this Pan-African activism that we were seen en masse. If you look at these photos, the Brooklyn Bridge is taken over, and we made a point. And I remember walking in downtown Manhattan, and white people were scared of us. And for a moment, we felt strong. For a moment, we felt powerful. We felt seen, we felt vindicated. So I think it's a powerful thing that you touch on. And yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jayaram, for your comments. It was so great to have you. Thank you both, Mr. Mack, Dr. Mack, and Dr. Jean-Louis, for this time. I do want to open it up for questions from other folks. Please feel free to ask your questions. I believe you presenters, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can ask your questions in Creole, in French, or English. All accents are welcome. Dr. Jean-Louis, go ahead.
Yeah, mbage problem at Creole. There may be some questions already in the chat.
Yes, yes,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I did see those. So yes, I just wanted to say that. And also, I just wanted to take this time to remind us all to cite each other and to drop names in rooms that, you know, our names aren't being dropped in for presentations and such things, because this is a combit. But I do know there is a question or two questions, one for each of you from Dr. Frederic Pierre. I don't know if she would like to unmute and ask, or if you would like for me to read them. Oh, is she still here? Oh, she just got kicked out. Okay, one second. Let's see. I think she's coming back in.
Yes, I am. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. I don't know if you heard me, but I said, would you like to ask your questions aloud, or you want me to read them?
Oh, absolutely. No problem. Thank you so much for wonderful presentations. Similar to Dr. Jean-Louis, I lived through some of the experiences that you're documenting in your scholarship. And I was just wondering, when we're thinking about model minorities, Asian versus Black immigrants, I was wondering if there is a comparison to be made between Haitian Black Korean relationships in New York City versus Korean/Asian relationships on the West Coast. So that's my question for Mr. Mack. And my question for Dr. Jean-Louis is, you mentioned there's a particular class of men who have global access to this new form of Blackness. And you mentioned something about masculinity, and I wondered if you could clarify what you mean, because that is an aspect of it that I don't think I hear about often enough. Thank you both very, very much.
Well, I can say from my own research doesn't touch upon the West Coast. At this point, at least, I haven't looked at it, but there are some books that I know of that do look at Black Korean relations in Los Angeles and really across the United States in general. One I'm thinking of specifically is No Fire Next Time by Patrick Joyce, which looks at Black Korean conflicts, not just in New York City, not just in Los Angeles, but more broadly in other parts of this in the country as well. My own research doesn't look at West Coast at this point, so I don't want to say anything too specific and make something up. So I don't want to answer that question, if that makes sense. Or I can't. I don't want to. I can't answer that question. Is a better way of responding.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Pierre, for your questions. And I find, so my research, and in doing the research, it's just a lot of dudes popped up. And from my MA thesis, my committee members, which included Chantal Verna, which I will name drop here as a Haitian scholar doing work, she and the rest of them encouraged me to find women. And I dig as I might. I did not find them in the sources. And one of the major sources was the slot form files in Paris. And these were written by agents of the French government. And, in one of the telling moments of their masculine gaze, Léo Sajus walks in and they describe him as walking in with two women on his arm, like he's some kind of a Don Dada or whatever. But when it turns out that those women were probably Jane and Paulette Nardal, two major intellectuals of Francophone Pan-Africanism. These women were brains who Brent Hayes Edwards has documented this in The Practice of Diaspora, if you're interested in reading more about it. And so has Sharply Whitting, and I'm missing one more, Ruby Patterson may have written about this as well. These women were the major intellectuals, but because there was a guy there, they are just two women, you know, like people he was seeing. And so it was hard to find. But then the more you read, you realize that you can do a critique of masculinity and then sort of still be a gendered analysis. And once you look, you find that these guys are, you know, tout Haïtien get fully chef is a saying, right? All Haitians have this, I don't know, predilection towards being the chief. But in fact, it's more than that. Part of masculinity describes it as being the head honcho. And so many times throughout my research in Paris, in the US, you find that a lot of these men can't work together because each of them want to be a chief. And then secondly, every time they talk about the Black race, it's he, masculine. And we know that at least 50% of the Black race are women. And so we look at this and you can find that gender is always present, even when women aren't present, right? And so we can take the gendered practices. And for me, I find that it has sort of interrupted the formation of diaspora, famously Du Bois and Garvey, whose programs were not that different, were in fact clashing the whole time, and getting together would have been so much more powerful. And this is to be the head chief. And I'm working on an article right now that suggests that Jacques Ouimet was able to see this. And if you notice in Gouverneur de la Rosée, the last person standing who's going to lead Haiti into the future is a woman. I forget the woman's name in the story, but it's Manuel's wife, the main protagonist's wife, and his mother are leading people in Haiti into the future. So I think that Jacques Ouimet, who goes into Paris and in New York in the aftermath of these conflicts, and even looking at Haiti and sort of patriarchy in Haiti, realized that this is an inherent problem and writes that in his masterpiece. If I can sort of hijack the conversation a little bit more than I already have, can I direct it to Dr. Chansey, who has had her hands up? I think she has something to say about women in France, Haitian women in France.
Absolutely. Dr. Chansey, I was coming to you right now.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I'm still getting used to the Dr. Chansey. Future Dr. Mack, because about 5 minutes ago, I was future Dr. Chansey. I do have a resource suggestion for you, particularly if you're looking for newspapers. They don't go all the way up necessarily to the 1990s, but the Digital Library of the Caribbean, DLOC.com, has a ton of Caribbean newspapers, including Le Nouvelliste and the Haiti Sun. So definitely consider, and they also they link out to the Radio Haiti archive. So that's definitely one that you want to keep in all of you, since we're dropping all of you who are working on Haiti or the Caribbean, definitely keep that in mind as you're doing your research. Now, Dr. Jean, yes?
Sorry, can you say the link again?
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to drop it in the chat.
Thank you. That's exactly what I was going to do for you, but whatever's easier.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't walk and talk at the same time. So
no problem.
There you go. I just put it in the chat for you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, there we go. Now, Dr. Jean-Louis, which of course, my former classmate and friend, I have a couple of questions for you. And yeah, good luck with finding Haitian women in France. Part of my dissertation, I wrote about Louise Chassis Louverture, who was Toussaint Louverture's niece and daughter-in-law. And I had to basically reconstruct her life by looking at the sources that were writing about her husband and her father-in-law. So the things we do. I am curious, you mentioned La Fraternité, the newspaper. What's the date on that? And where do those newspapers live?
Yeah, La Fraternité begins in 1890 is when Benito Silva inaugurates the newspaper. I found them at the Bibliothèque Nationale Française, François Mitterrand, but later on, I happened to find that if you Google it, the New York City Public Library has the digital version of that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I got to go to Paris, but nonetheless, you don't have to go that far to find them. Yes.
Darn. The other thing that I wanted to ask you, what's the role or the interaction between the Union Patriotique and the Indigeniste movement in Haiti in the 1920s, 1930s?
Well, I don't know if there's any direct link, except for somebody like Jean Price Mars, who was a member of the UP and sort of the sort of founding father of the movement. I think a lot of the intellectuals and elites that were associated were, I would at least say, sympathetic. Like I would have to look at the membership of the UP to see who are. But somebody like Jacques Ouimet, I think, was a member of the UP, but founded his own anti-occupation movement. I think that some of this, there's, in Haiti, there's this overlap, especially in the Port-au-Prince Club, that's about this big, especially at this time. So there's overlap, and I'm sure that there's overlap in difference, but I would have to look at the membership to tell you the exact
Yeah, no,
difference.
I was just curious if you knew. And then last one, and then I will cede the floor. Leo Sajous that you mentioned. Did I hear correctly that you said he was Haitian, but served as the Liberian ambassador to Poland?
Yeah. This is in 1934. So he's Haitian, goes to France in like 1915, 1916 to study medicine. And he gets very involved in the Pan-African movement. He's at the 1919 Pan-African Congress, but a little bit just as a observer. And as the time grows, he becomes heavily ingrained in the movement, the Ligue de Défense de la Race Noire and the Ligue de Défense de la Race Nègre. And there's a whole debate around Noir and Nègre that we can get into. But he becomes a major player in this. He founds his own movement for the students of African descent. It's short-lived, but he was both with the Marxist side and the moderate side. He offered his medical attention services to activists at discounted cost. And around 1931-2, he starts to write to the Haitian government to serve in this role. He starts to make connections with Poland. And in 1934-35, I haven't been able to fix it, he becomes the minister of Liberia to Poland. And of course, this is a third sort of major Black state, although it was founded by African-American migrants and heavily tied to England and the United States. It's an ostensibly free Black state, and it becomes a major site for people of African descent. And I think it had been for a repatriation. So again, he moves from this independent Black republic to this now free African state, and I think he dies there.
Yeah, no, very interesting. One of the things that I do research on is these entanglements between Poland and Haiti, which people don't realize goes all the way back to 1801, 1802. So, but that's the subject for another talk. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you, Dr. Chauncey. I believe we have a question from Catherine Jenkins. Would you like to unmute and read, or I can read it for you?
Okay, sure. Thank you so much for taking the question. I'm honored. First of all, thank you both so much for your presentations and for this space that you all are holding. My question was for Dr. Jean-Louis. I'm sorry, I'm getting over COVID. Am I getting the name right? Dr. Jean-Louis. Wondering if your studies took you at all into how the Haitian Revolution, and especially maybe Haitians being brought from, enslaved Haitians being brought from Haiti during the revolution to the Americas during the revolution, influenced earlier revolutionary movements in the Louisiana territories and US colonies, like the ones that I listed there in the chat, the Pan-Indian movement of 1812, and then the 1811 German Coast Uprising, which I believe is the largest uprising in what's now the United States. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's an important question. I think the book about Louisiana is by Nathalie Dessen. I think you'd have to check on that, but she wrote about Haitians who arrived in Louisiana. They started arriving in Louisiana around 1810. Louisiana, I think she argues, was a site of second displacement. That first, these people went to Cuba, sometimes to Charleston, if I remember as well. I read this book. And I don't know what the numbers of people who were formerly from Saint-Domingue arriving in Louisiana have to do with this uprising in particular. But I do know that this was the fear. This is why they were kicked out of Cuba in 1809. Matthew Childs writes a book about the Apante rebellion, or the attempted rebellion. And this is when there was the idea of Jean-François and Biassou, who had been Spanish soldiers, and as the way that the revolution unfolded, and remained Spanish soldiers. I think Georges Biassou becomes a governor of St. Augustine, the Spanish colony, and Jean-François, I think, dies in Spain. You have to look that up, but they remain. And so Pate, who was a Cuban, uses these images, and he has a book full of images of Christophe and the Toussaint, the Haitian revolutionaries, and he's trying to start a movement in Cuba. Ada Ferreira, I think I'm messing up her name, and at NYU writes about some of the people who went over at the beginning of her book is like a 2015 book that she wrote that, and it's very powerful to show how these Haitian know-how, Haitian technology, and Haitian human power went to launch the Cuban sugar industry that way into the 1970s was the backbone of their economy. I hope that helps. But this was the fear. I'm sorry. This was the fear of all the planters. I just read Julius Scott's book, I forget, Common Wind, right? And this was the fear of planters throughout the Americas, that not even the people, but the notion of the Haitian Revolution would come and disturb the plantation economy. And this is why, for me, I find it so powerful that the Haitian Revolution and Haiti remained such a salient figure all the way into the Harlem Renaissance. It's the occupation of Haiti that galvanizes some of this global movements that Du Bois and NAACP and other people of African descent were trying to affect. And it becomes a site for them to along with Haitians, to affect some of the things that they were trying to achieve globally.
If I may, I want to ask in response to that. You're looking at Pan-Africanism, and I'll just be personal about where this question is coming from. The Queen is dead, and the Commonwealth countries and countries that have been impacted by Britain, are celebrating just like they did with Prince Philip. In some ways, and we have a stake in celebrating that. But I will say yesterday it caused some things in me to see. I am Haitian American and Black American, and just to preface that. But anyways, it caused some things in me to see Black Americans now saying, oh, the Queen is dead, and she's been terrible, da 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 da. And why it caused some things in me is because at times I don't always feel in my studies, in the classroom, in the work that I'm doing, Black Americans are fighting for Haitians and what we're facing, or sometimes even not even aware, right? And so I have been attributing this and just even anti-Haitianism among Black Americans, or anti-Black immigration among Black Americans, Black immigrants, to US xenophobia, and that the US-centric xenophobia, the xenophobia of the United States, it touches Black Americans. And so I just want to ask, how does that anti-Haitianism and US xenophobia do you feel it impacts the Pan-African movement?
Yeah, you know, in the period that I'm looking at, I don't know if the Haitian anti-Haitianism is there. And I think this is a very interesting thing, I think, that emerges later on. At the start of the US occupation, I believe it's Brenda Gail Plummer, but somebody else who has written articles about the Afro-American response to the US occupation of Haiti. And you know, African Americans, US African Americans are US Americans, right? And so when the American media at the time, not media, I would say journalism, has produced these lurid tales of Haiti, of the voodoo, of, you know, holistic practices and all of these things, by the time of the advent of the occupation, several prominent US African Americans think it's a good idea. Haiti has sort of, because in the first part of the 20th century, I think Haiti had something like 9 presidents or 9 heads of state in the first 15 years. And so in that period, some African Americans had taken sort of a disappointed look towards Haiti at the time. But quickly into the occupation, Haitian women and Haitians abroad bring what is going on in Haiti to the NAACP and to other people of African descent in Paris. And quickly it becomes what is called a cause célébrée by Jennifer Boitin, I don't know how she pronounces it. And Haiti, I put Haiti in that cause célébrée, and it galvanizes. In the newspapers and across the Black world, the US occupation is there as an anathema to Black liberation. And so, yeah, there's a disappointment of what Haiti could have been vis-a-vis what was going on in the 20th century. But very quickly, it becomes sort of a galvanizing force. And Haitians in these moments, and the elite Haitians, I think somebody asked about these questions, and I say elite Haitians because in 1900, who has the money to leave Haiti? You know, it's not what was called the boat people phenomenon. This wasn't yet a major thing. So who has these are Haitian elites, men and women, who, if you look at the newspaper of the Harlem Renaissance, they're traveling, and these people are the epitome of the talented 10th, you know? So when Dante Belgaard gives a speech at the Schomburg to inaugurate the Haitian collection, he's talking to these other sort of elite people of African descent in the United States. When he's at Howard, and Howard is that sort of embodiment of talented 10th, you know, I think my collar is undone kind of stushness. He is them. And for me, I think I wrote that here is a descendant of Pétion talking to the descendants of Frederick Douglass, you know, with all the sort of elite notions of propriety involved, and including masculinity. I think that the US occupation was a double threat to Haitians because it took Haitian men and said, you are no longer masters of your country. And, you know, for a man in masculinity, how it's constructed, I don't mean like manliness, but in the construction of masculinity, those people who thought they were rulers of their land were informed of their racial subjugation. You know, people who had not thought of themselves in this way. You know, if you look at Vincent, he sees himself as a Black man, but he doesn't agree that Blacks should be subjugated. But then he goes and subjugates Black people in this country, you know? So there's all of these things in dynamism in this moment. Yeah, I hope I answered your question and then just ramble.
No, thank you so much. Dr. Mack, Mr. Mack, I'm already got Dr. Mack in my head.
Mr. Mack. Hey, let's take it one step at a time.
Put it out. No. Put it out in the universe. If you know you're going to do it, you will do it.
Yeah.
Well, I had I was going to ask about the occupation myself, because one of the things I wanted to add a chapter in my dissertation on the occupation of Haiti. And
Don't do it. Just finish.
Yeah, I wanted to, and I'm not going. So, but in the future, I'm thinking about looking at the U.S. occupation of Haiti, you know, during that time period, but I did come across some research on the Haitian Communist Party sending people into to New York City specifically, and working with unions. I'm thinking of the dressmakers union, and I think it was 1933, 1930, I can't remember the exact date, helping them organize strikes, and then going back to Haiti and organizing in Haiti. And I was wondering if you know anything about the Haitian Communist Party during that period, how it might have been received. I can make an assumption, but wondering how it might have been received by the United States occupying forces at that time, and how that might have played out in, the post-occupation time period, and the policies of the Haitian ruling elite after the U.S. left Haiti, left Haiti.
Yeah, no, for sure. I don't know where to start. When I was listening to your talk about disciplining individuals, I had the thought, and I wrote it down here, that the U.S. occupation is a disciplining moment. It works to discipline Haiti into sort of global currents. And so Jacques Ouimet is the founder of the Haitian Communist Party, and a couple others, and he's arrested. Am I chopping up? I see everybody from.
Okay.
You're okay now.
Yeah.
I'm okay now. Okay, sorry. So did you heard the disciplining part? And Jacques Ouimet is the founder of the Haitian Communist Party, and he's arrested for this communist by Sténio Vicente, the Haitian president. And what is he found with? He's found with newspapers from the French Communist, the Black French Communist Party, the Negro Worker, and all of these things. Jacques Ouimet, when he gets to Paris after his exile from release, is meeting with these communist connected groups throughout France. He's in a meeting with Léo Damas, the Negritude guy, about this. And so anti-communism becomes a huge current in Haiti, especially in the period that it's under the tutelage of the United States, right? And Cold War is ramping up in this moment. So you have Matthew Smith's book is the one that'll tell you all about this. And just to bring it to the peak, François Duvalier, every time that he wants to kill some people and get some money from the United States, he calls them communists. We killed some communists today. Hey, United States, give me more guns because I got to lock up some more communists. We're going to kill those communists, especially as Cuba. If this is Haiti, Cuba is right there. And Fidel Castro was looking over, and these guys were looking over. So Haiti becomes a bulwark against it as the Duvaliers are in power, and the more hawkish American presidents give him more money, him and his son, as long as they're killing communists. My partner's dad, if I can put it out there, was a communist who was arrested by Jean-Claude Duvalier. This is in the 70s for activism against the state. So all of this is there, and it becomes this sort of reoccurring thing throughout as Haiti becomes a satellite state of the U.S. I'm going to plug in my computer.
Okay, Dr. Mack, I have a question for you. I recently was invited to go to Korea to study North and South Korea relations and U.S. bilateral relations with South Korea. And what brought interest to me is the presence of South Korea in in Haiti. I'm not sure if you're aware, but South Korea has funded and been there's a Korean business that actually runs the sweatshops in Okap. And earlier this year, the women of those, I call them sweatshops, but they say industrial complex, they protested against their wages. And I'm very concerned about this because South Korea is a country that, is prided as being the only country to go from developing to developed. But you bring up, our hard past with the people of the Korean Peninsula. And I think that is still going on, just like deportation and such things are going on. And so I guess I'm wondering what we can learn. I don't really know. I'm just thinking of what my question is, because I'm still processing this trip, because as you said in your presentation, you know, Koreans were made this model minority, right, in the U.S. And I think that was part of also this collaboration between the U.S. government, the Haitian government, and South Korean corporations to develop Haiti, right? And I'm really fascinated by that argument. And so I guess your thoughts on that, on these notions of trying to fix the problem on the island so it doesn't come to the US, or the United States doesn't have to care for it as much. And now, like, third-party actors, third-party countries, it seems to me, appeasing the United States by saying, we'll help you with Haiti. But it's still being I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but it's still being somewhat a form of incarceration, right? What is it to have to go to work and not be paid, you know, and to be a prisoner to work? I feel like that is the capitalist agenda, to imprison us to work and to not pay us. And so really, are we fixing the problem with deportation if we're sending folks back to poverty and sweatshops where third-party big actors are playing with our lives? I know I don't really have a question and all that, but it was what was coming up.
I mean, no, there's a couple of things there that are really interesting in terms of like immigration and Koreans, you know, and Haitian immigrants. You know, and you think about, one of the things that I think about, you know, that you made me think about is this idea of whiteness in the United States and immigration and whiteness. And, you know, before the turn of the 20th century, to be considered white in the United States was to be very specific from Western Europe, you know, Anglo, you know, French, Germany, you know, that was the idea of white. You're Anglo-European. Over time, as more Southern and Eastern Europeans started to migrate to the United States, such as Italians, Jews, you know, Russians, Eastern Europeans, they came over. They were hyphenated Americans. At first, they were a sub-European group, less than Western Europeans. You know, their migration was very much controlled by numbers and, you know, so forth. After World War I, they became more of a hyphenated American, and they started to become incorporated into, you know, this idea of whiteness through World War II and into the 1940s and 50s, where now, you know, it's very common where you say, well, immigrants from anywhere in Europe, or the global North, are considered white. You know, they're considered, Italian Americans are considered white, Irish Americans are considered white, and so forth. One of the things that I found interesting is that this 1965, when the United States changed its immigration laws to allow people from Southeast Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, South and, you know, Central America to migrate and immigrate to the United States, which they weren't allowed to do because of, you know, racist immigration policies that literally limited the number of immigrants from those countries up to 1965. But what happened with, you know, and Haitian immigrants are a perfect example, is they migrated, but they were never incorporated or never given the opportunities to incorporate themselves into the idea of whiteness in the United States. And so Korean immigrants, on the other hand, as they were migrating at the same time, because of racial stereotypes, and Koreans themselves admitted this as much, especially during this boycott. And there's many boycotts going on of Korean stores and businesses, Asian businesses, by Black Americans, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, in Harlem, you know, all over New York City. Someone asked earlier about, you know, the Los Angeles West Coast connection, and we know about the Korean, you know, Black American tensions, especially with the 1994 uprising in South Central, and the you know, the violence that occurred there between Koreans and Black Americans. But Koreans were able to, you know, I'm sorry, let me step back. Koreans themselves also admitted that, they had stereotypes, racist stereotypes of Black Americans through their contacts with white Americans during the Korean War, during the occupation of Korea. And they were taught and they were told that, Black Americans are dirty, they're lazy, they're criminals, you have to watch out for them. And they said that they also, it's perpetuated through mainstream media on TV and in newspapers and so forth. So in terms of immigration, in the 1980s, as these groups started to become more prominent in New York City, it was almost a natural reaction for white mainstream media to accept Asians and Koreans as good Americans because they were building their own businesses. They had their own financial means and they had a whole system set up where they could, they helped each other. If you had a family here, and Haitian immigrants and other immigrant groups did as well, but they weren't accepted within this myth of the hardworking immigrants in the same way that darker immigrants were. I mean Asian immigrants were, darker immigrants were not. So I find it interesting, this idea of whiteness and as a kind of a indicator of power and identity, and how it could be very fluid to include certain groups and exclude other groups, depending on the mythology of anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism. So you made me think of that. And there is another point, but I've kind of went off and I forgot what it was at this point. So maybe come back to me.
No problem.
Dr. Jean-Louis also mentioned the 1970s and, anti-communism. One of the things that I've kind of looked at in my research is the federal, the US response to Duvalier's anti-communism, or what he dubbed anti-communism. And Nelson Rockefeller, who used to be the governor of New York and became one of Richard Nixon's kind of bosom buddies when Richard Nixon became, president in 1968. Nixon sent Rockefeller to Haiti to meet with Duvalier, specifically because Duvalier was doing so much, claiming to do so much anti-communism work. And I think his name is Henry Knox, the ambassador to Haiti. I think it was Henry Knox. Knox, I think his last name was, was confused as an ambassador to Haiti because on the one hand, there's years of, well, we need to keep Duvalier away because he's a brutal dictator and we don't like what he's doing, especially with the Kennedy administration. But then on the other hand, when Nixon became president, there was like this anti-communism law and order, wave that was sweeping over the United States. And Nixon, his approach was called coolness and correctness in terms of approaching Duvalier and Haiti and reestablishing connections where we can start sending them arms and weapons and money in order to pacify the Caribbean and eliminate, any communist influence. Even though the CIA was very clear that Haiti was never in any, threat of being influenced by the Soviet Union, simply Duvalier's, openness to claim that he's anti-communism gave Nixon this opportunity. And what happened is slowly over time, at first weapons were being injected into Haiti through private individuals in Miami and in other ways. But then eventually the federal government stepped in and started sending in massive amounts of materials and money, helping them, establish and train his leopards, his personal militia that was supposed to, counteract the Makuts. And the Marines were very much private and even eventually public training was very much involved in their creation. So this anti-communist Cold War era kind of relationship between Haiti, the United States is very fascinating. And a lot of what I do in one of my chapters is look at the incarceration on Haiti, in the prisons in Haiti, and what the prisoners were going through, and how the U.S. was at times literally present while anti-Duvalier activists were being tortured and being killed. And it was not something the United States didn't know that was going on. It was just something they ignored, as long as it worked within their, the Cold War politics of anti-communism at the time. So I thought that was a really interesting point to bring up.
Thank you.
If I can jump in, I'm sorry. I'm very excited by this conversation. Yeah, you know, a lot of these Tonton Macoutes, the leaders were trained at Fort Benning. I think Raoul Cedras, Henri Nafi, Prosper Avil, all of these major killers of people were all trained or trained by people who had been at Fort Benning. And as Fort Benning is a notorious base that trained a lot of these military men who became these anti-communist leaders throughout Latin America. There's a book about it. I don't remember who wrote it or not, but just to go back to the disciplining of the Haitian occupation, and sorry, I changed to my phone because my internet was messing up on my laptop. Yveline Alexis has a book about Charlemagne Perrault. And I think in this book, I've just started reading it. In this book, she talks about, she may talk about, but the whole thing is about the incarceration of these group of people and how that leads to the actually only military revolt, armed revolt against the United States, and then the atrocities that the military enacted on a gross number of thousands of people. So back to this Korea thing, the Koreans in Haiti, this is an outsourcing. South Korea is a US satellite. This was the reason for the war in 1950, whatever. And so this is outsourcing the subjugation of people, just like the US outsourced the occupation of Haiti to the Brazilians during the UN MINUSTAH period, as Maria Prosper and other people have argued. So this is part of it, that you can't do it all. It's bad press to do it all. And so if you have somebody else do it, now you can say, oh, look at these Korean capitalists. And I would like to look at the page of the stockholders of those Korean companies. I wonder how many of them are based in the United States. And you start to see how sort of racial capitalism, and this is the key term in all of this, plays out, that people of African descent are to be subjugated for the expansion of capitalist finances, whatever, I'm missing the word. Secondly, about those deported back to Haiti, and Rachel Magloire's documentary, Déportés, speaks to this. Some people are like me, or like you, people who have been in the United States for the majority of their life, who don't have people in Haiti. And so they're just dropped in this place. They don't speak the language. They are American. And if they speak Creole, it's with this heavy, you know, American accent. You know how everybody, our cousins who don't speak Creole speak it, you know? So these are the people who show up there. And this doesn't make somebody who can integrate into society. This makes people who cannot integrate into society. And it's the same thing in the US. If you have a felony in the United States, you can't integrate. So instead of keeping these people in US, where the US has to deal with them, they export the problem back to Haiti, or not back to Haiti, because they're Haitians as in general. And the last thing, you know, there are two Duvaliers. There's François Duvalier, who dies in 1971, and Jacques-Claude Duvalier, who dies in 1972. And they both have different relationships with the United States because of their own intellectual, and they both are dictators. They both kill tons of people. I'm not trying to defend one or the other, but just, you know, for Dr. Mack's analysis, to think about the nuances that all Duvaliers are not the same in every respect. They both kill a lot of people, though.
Yeah, no, Jean-Claude Duvalier, I mean, there's definitely a kind of a cleave in terms of relationships between the United States when Francois Duvalier passes away, hands off the baton to Jean-Claude Duvalier. I know, you know, Nixon and his ambassador Knox to Haiti were they didn't know how to approach Jean-Claude Duvalier because they looked at him as a young person. I'm sure, as you know, he was very young, very inexperienced, and very, inexperienced. And it's kind of like this, I'm sorry, I'm looking at something, I'm trying to bring up something and look at something at the same time. But in terms of the Duvalier, the difference is one specific, give me 1 second, there's one specific way of approaching it. Oh, they looked at Francois Duvalier as totalitarian, dictator, oppressive, violent, but also very kind of into his own thing. Jean-Claude Duvalier, they saw as a dictator and a totalitarian, but then he was also an oligarch in the sense of his exploitation of the people of Haiti, that, siphoning off the funds from the people of Haiti, the money that would go through the government, even the United States taxpayers were putting money into Jean-Claude Duvalier's pockets, helping his wife travel to Paris, on a whim. And, meanwhile, Haiti had one of the lowest, the highest poverty rates and lowest, income per capita in almost the entire world at the time. So yeah, there's definitely a big difference. And I thought what's interesting, the difference is in terms of Francois was very much kind of the dictator who kept Haiti enclosed within a small little capsule, I guess you can say, while Jean-Claude Duvalier was much more open to investment, all to his own benefit and a few of his cronies benefit as well. And they're amassing a massive amount of wealth.
Thank you both. I just want to make sure if anyone else has any last questions for our presenters. Okay, well, I'm gonna transition us out with some reminders, and then we'll have some last comments from our speakers. So I'm gonna pose my last comment so they can have a couple seconds to think about their last remarks. And so for our last remarks, I would like for both of you to speak about how these particular pieces you are working on have impacted the way you move throughout the earth, whether that's with your family, whether that's in academia, or just in our world. How have these pieces impacted you, or even, how you move with yourself throughout the world? So I'll give you some time to speak about that while I remind folks that H.S.A. is October 7th through the 9th in Washington, D.C. at Howard University. This cafe is being put on by the Emerging Scholars, and the Emerging Scholars are I forget what we call ourselves, caucus or us that meet and have been meeting all year, are putting together LACU, yes, Emerging Scholars LACU is putting together mentor-mentee relationship. So if you would like to participate in our mentorship program that we're instituting, please let us know. You should receive an email about it once you register. But I'm gonna shamelessly say, even if you don't plan on attending, please sign up. Please email us for a mentor or mentee, and you can choose to be both a mentee and a mentor to someone. So please, 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 that is how the Combit works, and that's how we can stand flat-footed and confident. And that's what I wanted to encourage us all, to stand flat-footed and confident in our scholarship, in us knowing what we know. I know it can be so hard in all the places we are doing, and just swimming in text and all of that, and it's such a beautiful thing. But I want you all to stand flat-footed in the work that you're doing, and knowing that the ancestors are on your back, on your front, above, beneath, to your right and left. And also at HSA, if you are attending, we and you would like a roommate, we can connect you with someone else who would like a roommate. So that does require registration. And we will, you'll get an email about the roommate. I'm losing all my words, but if you want a roommate, we'll connect you with someone who also wants a roommate. And lastly, as I said, which I feel is very relevant, and I didn't know it would be to both of our presenters' presentations, this Tuesday, I will be hosting a emergency call to action for 30 men and their families who have recently been deported back to Haiti. Very similar experiences to some of those that we've heard today, where they do not have family to cook for them, where they do not have the proper medical attention, and also they are, in order to be released, in order to be released, they need to pay a high ransom to the police commissioner, who has instituted that practice of indefinite imprisonment, which stopped, I believe, in 2007 or 2012. But since the assassination, he is placing ransom on folks who should just be temporarily held in the national prison and then released after a few days. So yes, please, if you can share that, send people. I will have a recording. All are welcome, and I will post the link for you to register to get a Zoom link. But let's hear from our speakers in the last couple minutes, and we'll start with Mr. Dr. Mack.
Thank you. This has been great. Thank you so much for inviting me and allowing me the opportunity to hear so much wisdom and on Haiti and Haitian, politics and people and culture is just amazing. And I'll keep this very straight and simple. I've had a long talk. We've spoken for a lot already. Since I started this project, since I really kind of started to research Haitian history, start to really understand the importance of Haitian history, I think is probably one of the most overlooked aspects of Western history, historiography, and U.S. history too, because I think you can't have U.S. history without Haitian history, and I think it's one of those things things that are ingrained in white supremacy and is U.S. exceptionalism and fear of a Black republic that really permeates our society today, both internally, domestically, and also in our foreign relations with other countries, specific and indigenous people, I should add as well, across the globe. One of the things I've really kind of started to see and understand is this idea of racial capitalism that was already brought up earlier, and how it really does dictate, how our lives work and how we function as a society, and the role that race and capitalism play, together in terms of establishing systems of power and hierarchies of power, and that really do literally eliminate, people from the world, from society, from their families, from their friends, from their community. And it's very important that we continue to have these dialogues and we continue to interrogate these issues and we bring them to the forefront, regardless of, whatever, attempts are being made to silence, under this, nonsense kind of rhetoric of CRT here in the United States, or other kinds of ways of silencing thought and pushing the envelope on exposing these kind of systems of power. So that's been my biggest takeaway from this, as my own development and working through my dissertation and hopefully completing my dissertation and continuing my research. I really hope that I can continue to grow and develop and learn from all that I have available to me. So appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Before I go and answer the question, I would like to thank, and I'm piggybacking on Dasha Chapman, to thank Magali Civil for pulling this in together and wrangling me in as a person who is by genetic construction aloof and unaware of the world, and who now has a 6-month-old child who cannot remember anything. Her persistence got me here. I appreciate that tremendously for this great panel, and Dr. Toussaint for setting the tone, for moderating, and for making me feel bad for having this boring bookshelf behind me trying to look smart. And look, he coordinated his shirt with his flower, y'all. This is next level Zoom. But he did also start the conversation by pouring out some water. And this is very important in memory of the ancestors. And my work stands in direct relationship to my ancestors. Because of this, when I first read Michel Legail's 1984 Odyssey book, I don't know if I have the whole title right, in the back, he talked about a migration of Haitians during the US occupation. And in my own family lore, my great-grandmother, who was born in the Haitian countryside, Louise Jean-Louis, came or tried to come to the United States via Ellis Island. She was not an elite man. She was she was a non-literate pregnant woman who was summarily turned away. In her stomach was my grandfather. My family then moves to the United States. This same grandfather moves to the United States in 1969. Some conversation has been had here about migrants and race, and I think class is also a very big thing. We were part of the Haitian middle class, the middle class that faces sort of the elite. So my family was educated, and we were part of these people who after 1965 came with visas. And so for me, this is sort of a finding of myself in my research. My grandfather came as he was part of the Haitian army in the 1940s on this joint project in Harlem. And as a Haitian American who was grew up in New York, the Harlem Renaissance was such an alluring thing for me. And it was such a great thing to be able to find that Haitians were part of this thing, part of a thing that my grandmother was denied access to because of her race, because she was an unwed woman, because of her, I don't know, of her non-ability to read. I can't put this into words. And secondly, I'm also reminded of Keisha Blaine. She put an article out about the supposed objectivity of historians, and she argues against that. And part of this, and I think Dr. Mack has talked about this, is the erasure of people in history, people of African descent, people of color in general, and women in general. So doing this work, for me, goes to elevate these people, to say that Haitians, people like my grandmother, are history makers. We can find ourselves in history. So in the Age of Revolution, when I teach that class, Haiti is there. And I tell them Haiti is the only Age of Revolution place that really was liberatory. And this is the work that we are trying to do. I pretend no objectivity. I am particularly subjective. I am a Haitian. I am a Black man. And this is what I write about. And I'm passionate about it. And places like these are welcoming places that allow even up-and-coming scholars who don't have their PhD yet to speak freely and to find support. And I am happy to have spoken here, and I am glad for the invitation. Thank you.
Merci, 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 chapeau bas to each of you. This has been so good. I say amen, ashe, ayi, bobo to it all. And I thank Magali for putting this together. I thank the Emerging Scholars for supporting her. And I thank you all for showing up and supporting us as we try to figure this all out. Yes, please, please, please let us know. I put Magali's bio info in the chat if you would like some space to share in our Laku. Please do not be timid or shy. This is your space, and we are here to hear and refine and challenge and also affirm all that you are and all that you are doing. And to remind you that you aren't your work, that you are separate from your work, even though it is brilliant. So thank you all so much. Happy Friday. And yes, we will see. Magali, the next cafe is in, am I wrong? Is it in January?
Yeah, no, October, 14 October.
Okay, October.
Yeah, but Magali,
so
parle no Magali, so we can hear something from you. Yes.
You see, she put me in front. I said, Magali, you can moderate.
Right.
Oh, merci Félix, merci Nia pour travail. Naya, pour travail nous, c'est extraordinaire. C'est on discussion que t'es riche en pile. Et il vraiment gain forme que nous t'es attendant d'achat, Naya, Irène, un café vraiment dynamique café. Hein. So, c'est un plaisir. À bien un prochain café 14 octobre.
Okay, thank you, Magali. Merci en pile pour tout travail. Okay, everyone, please enjoy your weekend, get some rest, and we do hope to see you in October for the H.S.A. conference, but then also right after, we'll be back together to talk about each other's work. Thank you.